The purpose of this video is to provide a little bit more information about resumes and to highlight some of the elements that I want you to consider in particular as you create and revise your own resume. So just a reminder, purpose of the resume is that it gives a concise overview of your education, experience, skills, and other information. This means that the resume doesn't necessarily include every single piece of information ever about you as an employee, but it highlights particular elements of your education and your work experience, as well as relevant skills that you might have. So if you find that you're just putting every single thing on your resume, you really want to pull back and think about what would be most relevant to your user as you go. And this is how it feeds into that persuasive element of a resume. Resumes are meant to persuade your reader that you are a competent professional, that you're somebody who's worth considering as an employee. And so you want to communicate the information that you have very clearly, very concisely, and to a reader who may not have a lot of time to wade through a lot of information. So there are two major ways that you communicate through your resume. One is by the visual appearance as well as the content. So first, just to remind you, the two different types of resumes you have available to you are the chronological or the skills-based resume, or which is also called the functional resume. The chronological arranges experience in reverse chronological order, beginning with your most recent experience first, whereas the skills-based or functional resume arranges experience by skill or instead by relevant experience. So you might include only selected pieces of your work experience, for instance, if you have a lot of different jobs over the course of your career. The textbook offers two really good models here of why one might choose a chronological resume or a functional resume, depending on what you're trying to do. You want to choose based on what you're applying for, who you're trying to appeal to, and then your own qualifications and experience. For those of you with less experience, you might find that the chronological resume is your best choice because you don't have a lot of information or relevant experience to convey to your reader. Whereas for those of you who do have a lot of relevant experience and perhaps are coming back and getting a degree, to provide formal education to back up the experience you already have, you will find that the skills or functional resume is the most appropriate. So choose carefully based on your own experience. The next thing I want to talk about is appearance. So content and appearance are the two major ways that a resume communicates. And appearance is the one that people see the most. So when you begin your resume, first thing you want to do is create 1-inch margins. If you find that your resume has smaller than 1-inch margins or bigger than 1-inch margins, one of two things is going to happen. For those that have smaller margins, it looks really cluttered and clustered, and it makes it visually overwhelming for the user. If you have bigger than 1-inch margins, it makes it look like you're trying to make your resume look bigger than it actually is. So be really careful there. The second thing you want to consider, in addition to margins, is a use of a clear typeface. Don't use anything fancy. This is not the time to bust out the most elaborate fonts that you have. Design that is effective in technical settings does not call attention to itself. A font that is decorative is going to call attention to itself, and you don't want that to happen. And in fact, in a lot of professional settings, you'll essentially get made fun of if you opt for the fancier font. So stick with something clean, professional, and simple. You have two primary choices in the type of font you can use. One is what's called a serif font. It's fonts such as Times New Roman, Georgia, or Garamond. There are many others, as well as Verdana or Arial, which are sans serif fonts, is the other class of fonts. So there's a couple of ways you can think about using fonts here. And again, if it's clean and simple and clear, it works. So don't only stick with the ones that I list here. These are just examples that I'm offering. Sans serif fonts, which is actually what the majority of this PowerPoint is formatted with, are fonts that do not have what's called the serif. So it's the little line that is at the edge of each of the letters. So for instance, if you look at the V, you notice it's just straight, clear, and clean. And it is seen as being more appropriate for use on screen, whereas the serif font is seen as more appropriate for the use in print text. So you'll find that your textbook, for instance, is printed primarily using a serif font instead of a sans serif font. For a resume, you might consider which you prefer. I find that Serif fonts are seen as more traditional, whereas sans serif are also seen as more contemporary and modern. So if you're trying to create a sense of yourself as a professional and you want to do that through your typeface, you might opt to use a sans serif font instead. So here for the example resume that I offer, this is actually using two sans serif fonts. I use Arial and I use Calibri. Now, common sense may have told you that you're only supposed to use one font or one typeface at a time, but you can actually combine, I would say, up to two different typefaces. And there's a couple ways you can think about those combinations. Two different typefaces become a way of creating contrast between elements of your document. So you notice here there's a heavier bold font and then a lighter not bold font. And I'm using Arial for my information, my contact information, and also for my headers. And while my header is using size as one way to create contrast, I then have these individual headers that also use Arial. So there's repetition and consistency. But then it also creates contrast with the Calibri Light font that I use in the sections themselves. So just be sure you're thinking very carefully about fonts in those ways. And you're also wanting to arrange elements to give a balanced appearance with enough white space in between different sections, clear organization, and appropriate use of indentation and bullets. So if we return back, you see that I don't have a bunch of bullets all over the place. In my education section, for instance, I refrain from using a ton of bullets, and I'm actually also using the width of the page as well as the length of the page. So there's something called the power zone, where across the top and down the left-hand side of your page, those are the areas where your eye instinctually falls based on how we read. So since we read from top to bottom and left to right, this top left-hand corner is the most powerful element of your document. So you want to consider very carefully. So this is why my name, instead of being centered, is on the left. You can center your header because it's in that power zone, which is across the top. So that's not something that's necessarily a negative thing to do. This is just what I chose to do here. But those headers do want to be on the left-hand side. Don't center them, don't pop them over on the right. And as you go down, you can see that the most important information tends to fall along the left-hand margin, but I also want to make use of the full width of the page, and so I include some things over here on the right-hand side. And this just makes use of that whole width of the white space and ensures that I'm not clustering everything all on the left-hand side. Now, you want to be careful if you have dates like I do here, make sure that all of the dates are aligned with the right-hand margin. Otherwise, you get a little bit of a less balanced appearance. And, you know, you could argue that this is okay because of it being a different section, but it might look more visually appealing for it to be over here on the left side. So your resume contains these kinds of content. You're identifying information, education and experience are the two primary things that it's meant to convey. And then there's these other sections that you can include. In terms of objective and summary of qualifications, I would refrain from using one unless you have a particular reason to do so. Objectives are often useful if you're taking your resume to a career fair and you want to have a really sharp, clearly written objective that tells your user essentially what you're after when you're passing it out to a wide variety of users or readers. If you're applying to one particular position, I find that these sections are a little problematic. They often are vague and poorly written, and they're distracting. Your user usually just wants to jump to your experience, and you're bogging it down by including this information at the top. If you have interested activities that are relevant for a position, you can include those, but be careful with what you include there, making sure it is useful and relevant to the user. You have your honors and awards, which would be things to crow about, your achievements. You could place some of those in your education section, but I often again find that they go better toward the end of a resume. And then if you have particular computer skills, military service, or language knowledge, you would include that potentially in a final section at the end of the resume. If you are applying for a tech job that looks for particular kinds of computer skills, that section actually could potentially go earlier in the resume as well. So you just want to carefully consider where those sections should fall. Under computer skills, do not put Microsoft Office unless the job application specifically says they want you to use Office. Most people claim they understand how to use Microsoft Word, and most people have used it before. It's not that big of a skill to crow about, but I also find that people say they know Microsoft Word, and what they mean is that they can open a document and type. It doesn't mean that you are proficient at using the program in an expert way. Save that section for including information such as like more challenging programs or programs that are relevant to the position you're applying for. So if you're an electrical engineer, putting MATLAB and SPICE, for instance, or Eagle, some of those, or programming languages, depending on what you're after. The next section is your education section. It should include your degree, institution. This is one of the primary sections you should include in your resume. So it has all of the information about your education. If you have high school experience on your diploma, take it off. You do not need to keep high school experience on there. So here on my education section, you see I put my degrees, which are an MA in English and a BA in English and Spanish. I include my GPA because they're pretty good. I include the date that I graduated, and I include the place that I got my degree from and any minors under there. This is one of many ways to format this section. One of the things you want to pay attention to is that you only include education that you have earned a degree. So if you have credits from CWI, for instance, but you didn't earn an associate's, don't include that on your education section. All of that's been transferred to Boise State. Just keep it as Boise State itself. If you did earn an associate's or you earned certificates or any kind of certifications, do include this in your education section. And for most of you, you will have an expected graduation date. So you will say expected May 2019, for instance. So be sure to include that information. The other thing that you want to do is your experience section. It can come before or after education, depending, and it should include the position details, the dates, the organization, and the job title, and a very specific description of your job duties. This section is the hardest to write because you want to be really, really clear and use very powerful verbs. So don't say something like, I was responsible for blah, blah. Like you want to instead say designed and created or implemented or some other kind of powerful verb that highlights the skill that you have and your various achievements. And these descriptions require the most attention and revision to make them clear and concise. So you want to spend a lot of time focusing on this section. So to remind you just to think about organization with these, you can arrange your resume in a number of ways. You want to consider what is most appropriate to your user or your reader and what they're going to be looking for. So if you think that they're much more interested in your relevant work experience, put your experience first and then your education. That should be the two orders. If you are an entry-level person, they're looking for education, you don't have relevant work experience in the sense that it's in that industry, put your education and then put your experience. And then consider the other sections and what you think should be the most important. Keep in mind that the most important information should come first, and then from there, less important information is arranged in the order. So what you want them to understand and see should fall early in the resume. If you have a 2-page document, make sure all of the important stuff is on that first page and the less important stuff is on the second page. And make sure the organization makes sense. And again, remember, they're looking at your education and experience and then some of these other skills. So keep that all in mind. Finally, remember to not include high school experience unless in the very rare case it's actually pertinent to what you're applying for. I've only seen it in a very few number of times. Most of the times high school experience is great, but it's not relevant to what you're doing and nobody's really after it that much. So your takeaways here are that your resume should communicate with both appearance and content. And as a writer, you have a lot of choices with how you craft this resume. I've given you an example, your textbook's giving you an example. So carefully consider these various factors about what will be persuasive and visually appealing, and consider obtaining some samples from others in your field to help you as you develop your own and to learn what kinds of choices you can make.